The hooves struck first. Thudding against the packed dirt road, they shattered the stillness of dawn. Chickens scattered. A clay pot cracked under the weight of panic. And in a thatched rooftop home, a mother jolted awake, not from sleep, but from dread she had buried for years. The kind only a mother in the Balkans would know during the time of the Devshirme. The riders had come. Their silhouettes moved like shadows with purpose. Ottoman Sipahi horsemen, draped in black, their turbans dark and tightly bound, as though mourning something that hadn't happened yet. The village priest had spotted them first from the bell tower, just before the mists had lifted. He didn't ring the bell. He knew better. This was no raid. It was something far colder. Sanctioned. Ritualized. A horror written into law. 3 men dismounted in the village square. They did not shout nor threaten. They didn't need to. The villagers gathered like cattle under storm clouds, ushered by a fear passed down from father to son, fear of the Sultan's collectors. This was not war. It was harvest. You were 12. Or was it 13? Age became slippery the moment the Ottoman official's parchment came out. The man read names like a butcher reciting cuts. Each was pulled from memory, census, whispers from local collaborators. The empire had long arms and sharper ears. A boy 2 years older than you tried to run. His name was Luca. His mother clung to his tunic until it tore. He didn't make it far. A single rider caught up and struck him hard. Not with a blade, but with the flat of a spear. The kind of blow meant to preserve the merchandise. You saw him piss himself. This was not new. It had happened here once before, 8 winters ago, when your cousin was taken. Some boys returned in dreams, bloated and dressed in silk. Others never did. This was the price of peace under Ottoman rule. They called it Devshirme, the blood tax. Historians today debate its nature. Was it slavery or social mobility? A path to power or a death sentence draped in brocade? But in that moment, standing in that square, none of that mattered. To the barefoot villagers, it felt like the hand of God had been replaced by a velvet-gloved fist. You watched your mother crumble when they pointed at you. Her voice, usually sharp, unflinching, collapsed into pleading sobs. She offered coins, then livestock, then herself. The officer looked past her. The rider behind him tightened his reins. You were chosen, not for your strength, not for your knowledge, not even for your obedience. No, they chose you for your face. Symmetry, lashes like a doe's, a softness around the jaw that could be molded into something pleasing. You wouldn't be a soldier, not like the other boys taken that day. Your fate was different. You were marked for the palace. The cart they loaded you into had thick velvet drapes and a stale, perfumed stench. Inside were 3 other boys, one from a hill village to the east, another with hair so blonde he looked like a painting, and the last, barely 9, sobbing in hiccups. No one explained what came next, but the men in black exchanged glances that spoke of what had already been decided. One of them scratched a tally into a leather notebook. Another handed a folded decree to the village elder, who bowed not out of respect but fear. Then the horses turned. The dust that rose behind them would take hours to settle. The silence left behind would last longer. Back in the cart, you stared at your hands and wondered why they hadn't trembled. You tried to speak, but found no voice. Not because of shock, no. It was the absence of it. The numbness, the stillness inside you. As though some deeper part had already accepted its own erasure. The horses moved faster now. Fields turned to marsh, then to stone roads carved by centuries of conquest. At one point, you passed a crucifix left shattered by previous campaigns, now used as a resting post for birds. Another time, you glimpsed a disfigured man with no nose selling roasted chestnuts near a checkpoint. His eyes caught yours just for a second. He looked away. In the distance, past the veil of trees and the stink of horse sweat, rose a shape you had only heard of in stories. Istanbul, a city of gold roofs, endless domes, and monstrous silence. As you approached, your cart turned east, away from the main roads used by merchants and pilgrims, and into a smaller path hemmed by high stone walls. Guards flanked each corner. When the doors ahead opened, they did so not with grandeur, but with finality. The harem quarters. But you didn't know that yet. All you knew was that the world you had known, your mother's embrace, the scent of river moss, your name, had already begun to dissolve behind you, and no one looked back. They stripped you silently. No ceremony, no kind voice, no words of comfort. Just a courtyard of white tiles stained by decades of fear, steam rising in lazy curls from the bathhouse beyond, and the sour scent of rosewater failing to mask the copper tang of old blood. The eunuch who first laid eyes on you said nothing. He simply circled you, his gaze clinical, disinterested, the way a butcher might inspect a lamb he hadn't yet decided to slaughter. His skin was dark as teak, his robes immaculate, and his hands, gloved, always gloved, never stopped moving, adjusting a sash, snapping fingers, signaling to the two younger men behind him. You were handed over without a word. The younger eunuchs, apprentices, you'd later learn, guided you into the hammam. Their touch was soft but absolute, like wind that carried knives. Inside, the steam choked you. It smelled of old skin, crushed lavender, and secrets. Candles flickered in the corners, their wax clinging to the stone in malformed teardrops. The marble floor was wet and warm. You were told to kneel. They shaved your head first, then your arms, your legs, your eyebrows, your innocence. This was the purification. Water was poured over you, again and again, until you couldn't tell where your body ended and their hands began. They scrubbed until your skin peeled. One boy screamed beside you, his cries echoing off the tiles like trapped birds. You didn't scream, because deep down you understood this was only the beginning. The eunuch returned when it was done. He gestured toward a small side room, tucked behind a thick velvet curtain. You were led inside. There was a narrow cot, a wooden bucket, a long table with metal instruments arranged like surgical prayers. You saw the blade. You saw the cloth. You saw the quiet nod between two of the attendants. And still no one spoke. Modern scholars still argue over the exact method used. In some provinces, it was partial, in others total. Some boys were given opium. Some weren't. In your case, they gave you a thin leather strap to bite. Then the pain came. There are no words for that part. Not because it's unspeakable, but because your mind never truly recorded it. Trauma has its own language, and yours was written in white noise and the sound of your own teeth cracking against leather. You awoke feverish. Days had passed. A poultice of honey, crushed pomegranate, and burned wool wrapped your groin. You couldn't move without whimpering. In the corners of the infirmary, other boys stirred. Some wept. Some just stared, already empty. A few never woke at all. Death was common. Infection more so. One of the apprentices whispered that the stone drains below the palace had clogged the week before. So many bodies had been disposed of, the water no longer flowed right. A low-ranking eunuch had been beaten for the smell. But you survived. They called that a blessing. The next phase was language. You were no longer allowed to speak your native tongue. Greek, Albanian, Serbo-Croatian. It didn't matter. Ottoman Turkish now ruled your lips, or silence would. A tutor was assigned. He wore rings on every finger and struck you lightly when you stumbled on your verbs. He renamed you. Not because your name was hard to pronounce, but because it wasn't worth remembering. You were now Mehmet, or Qasim, or Yusuf. The truth is, even that was temporary. In the palace, names were just placeholders until a master found favor in your form. Then came the body training. Your posture was corrected. Your walk softened. Your diet changed. No garlic, no onion, nothing that could sour the breath or inflame the stomach. Meals became tools. Dried figs for laxity, melon to brighten the skin, rice water to calm the bowels. You learned to smile just enough to be pleasing, never enough to be noticed. One boy was punished for laughing too loud, another for failing to bow low enough to a eunuch twice his size. The hierarchy was rigid. You were not at the bottom, surprisingly. That position belonged to the kitchen boys, the ones whose castration had been botched, whose voices cracked too low, whose teeth weren't worth displaying. They were the shadows of the harem, forever fetching water or scrubbing walls stained with the memories of those more desirable. You were being groomed, not for labor, not for scholarship, but for service. The word meant many things in the palace. Sometimes it meant pouring tea for a visiting vizier. Other times, it meant spending an evening behind drawn curtains with a prince too bored for protocol. Most nights, it simply meant enduring the gaze of the chief black eunuch, who roamed the halls like a god in human skin. The chief eunuch ruled the inner palace. He answered only to the Sultan himself. His eyes never blinked. His voice was never raised. And yet every child, every silken, hollowed-out child trained in the harem, feared him more than death, because he could end a life with a nod. One day, he watched you train. You held a silver tray above your head, careful not to spill the rose sherbet. Your wrist trembled only slightly. He passed without comment. That night, your tutor kissed your forehead. You were advancing, but advancement in the harem was a curse with lacquered edges. The closer you rose to the Sultan's chambers, the less of yourself remained. You began to speak in practiced tones, like a flute drilled to play only one song. You smiled when commanded. You bowed when glanced at. And all the while, the wound beneath your robes throbbed in rhythm with your heartbeat. You learned to ignore it. Pain was part of the palace. Just another scent beneath the incense. Just another echo behind the silk-covered walls. The riders who had brought you were long gone. Your village, your mother, your name, dust on the boots of history. Only the walls remain now. The walls and the eyes. It started with a mirror. Not one made of glass, but of polished brass, warped at the edges and clouded in the center, like truth refracted through oil. You were handed it during your final phase of training. "Look," said your overseer, his voice almost kind. "Learn how others must see you." You barely recognized the boy staring back. Smooth cheeks, lips tinged with rosewater, eyes that fluttered lower than any prince's. A creature of symmetry and submission. There was no trace left of the boy who had once wrestled goats behind the chapel, who had once carved a slingshot from plumwood. He had been replaced. What stood in his place now was not quite a servant, not quite a prisoner, not quite a man. You were now a concubine. To outsiders, that word evoked silken lounging and whispering pleasures. But within the palace, it meant something else entirely, a silent offering. An instrument of desire shaped by imperial obsession. Your every gesture had been rehearsed. You had been taught how to pour coffee in one fluid motion, how to kneel without creasing silk, how to speak in fragments that flattered but never interrupted. Your perfume was carefully chosen, ambergris, faint and warm, thought to stir melancholic affection. You were not expected to feel, only to evoke feeling in others. And when your summons came, it was not dramatic. No trumpet, no scroll. Just a quiet knock in the night. A eunuch appeared and gestured. You followed him barefoot, your footsteps soft against the marble like moth wings. He led you through a corridor rarely seen by lower servants, arched, candlelit, lined with painted tiles of pomegranates and falcons. The tiles were beautiful. The meaning behind them, you would learn later, was less so. Blood and conquest. Desire and dominance. You were brought to a room cloaked in velvet. Inside, the prince. Not yet sultan, but close enough that people feared him more than death. He lounged on a dais of pillows, smoking something that hissed like burning herbs. He didn't look at you at first, just sipped from a silver cup and muttered to the eunuch. Then his gaze slid to you, like a net tightening around a fish. You bowed, as taught, as expected. He laughed softly. "Stand up. Let me see." You stood. He circled you once, then twice. Fingers grazed your chin, then your collarbone. You felt nothing. Not revulsion, not attraction, only calculation. You had been trained for this moment, prepared like a dish for the table. But no training could stop your heart from beating too fast. Eventually, he nodded. "You will stay." And so you did. The next morning, no one acknowledged your absence. No one asked where you'd gone or why. That was part of the design. The harem ran on silence. Your presence at the prince's side became more frequent. You poured his drinks, recited verses to ease his migraines, sat near him when foreign dignitaries visited, dressed in gold-threaded robes meant to imply innocence and invitation all at once. But you were not his only companion. Others were vying for the same shadow. Some were prettier, others more cunning. One boy from Trebizond had a singing voice so pure it made old men weep. Another had a birthmark shaped like the crescent moon, which the astrologers claimed was a sign of divine favor. Competition was quiet but cruel. Your robe once went missing before a gathering. You were forced to appear late, flustered. The prince laughed, but his eyes lingered elsewhere that night. You began to understand the real rules of the palace. You were not loved. You were collected. Your beauty was not a gift. It was a time bomb. Because what pleased the Sultan today might bore him tomorrow, and what bored him tomorrow might offend him next week. There was no warning, no second chance. You heard of one boy, Mikhail, his name had been, who laughed when the Sultan slipped on rosewater. An innocent giggle, a reflex. 2 days later, he disappeared. The only trace left was his embroidered sash, found stuffed behind a cabinet near the baths. Another was rumored to have grown facial hair too early. They gave him wine laced with crushed poppy. He never woke up. Historians debate the extent to which the Sultan's concubines had agency. Some suggest they could wield influence in the right circumstances, through pillow talk, flattery, or careful alliances with senior eunuchs. But for every story of a favored concubine whispering state secrets, there are dozens more who simply vanished. You learned quickly. The art of erasure was prized here. Your diary, if you dared to keep one, would have been confiscated. Even your dreams seemed monitored. You once muttered in your sleep, and the next day, the chief eunuch called you in to recite poetry aloud, for assessment. You passed, but just barely. The more time you spent near power, the more fragile you became. You smiled more, but it felt like breaking glass behind your teeth. You were praised for your stillness, for your restraint, a word they used to mean absence of will. The prince gifted you a peacock feather once. It was beautiful, opalescent, but when you held it in your hands, all you could think of was how it came from a bird too heavy to fly. That's what you were now. Beautiful, watched, grounded. Sometimes you wondered if anyone outside the palace even remembered you. Not your name, but your existence. Could your mother still see your face in her dreams? Did your sister light a candle for you at the old chapel? Or had the years stolen you entirely, like water eroding a name from stone? You never cried. Not because you didn't want to, but because in the palace, tears were seen as leaks in the porcelain. And once something leaks, they throw it away. You learned to smile when your stomach was empty. Not because you were starving. No one in the inner palace starved. But food, like affection, was rationed with precision. Every bite, every morsel, every sip of cinnamon water passed through the same unseen filters as praise and punishment. If the chief eunuch liked you, your rice was cooked in almond milk. If he didn't, you got sour lentils and yesterday's bread. This was the hierarchy of the unwhole. The harem wasn't just a prison of silk. It was a machine of rank and ritual. And eunuchs, those who had been carved and claimed by the empire, were its gears. At the bottom were the stable rats, boys who had survived the castration but not the training. Their voices cracked, their backs bent. They cleaned latrines, carried piss pots, and slept near the kitchens where rats danced in the walls. Then came the Polish pearls, the pale boys from the north, usually prized for their skin but discarded once their novelty faded. Some lasted a few months. One managed a year. None made it beyond that. You were somewhere in the middle, not beautiful enough to be legendary, not low enough to be invisible, which meant your days were filled with paranoia. There were tests, always tests. The way you knelt, the way you reacted when the Sultan's cat brushed your leg, the way you answered when a jealous concubine said something cruel, just loudly enough for others to hear. One morning, your slipper went missing. The rule was simple: appear barefoot before royalty, and you'd be removed. Not punished publicly, just removed. Sent to a lesser palace, or a monastery, or a grave no one marked. You found the slipper beneath the cushion of a rival's seat. You said nothing, because silence was power. Retaliation, even when deserved, was seen as pride, and pride was a sin in those who had already been made less than men. And yet, for those who rose above, the rewards were dazzling. The chief white eunuch, your superior in the palace's spiritual arm, was once a Bulgarian boy taken the same year you had been chosen. Now he wore gold-threaded robes, dined on stuffed quail, and had influence over the Sultan's moods. His words could exile a vizier or elevate a kitchen boy. He was what the records called Kisler Agassi, master of the girls, ironically. Though he himself could father no child, his decisions dictated the fate of the Sultan's many sons, wives, and concubines. He once summoned you for a private reading. You entered the chamber, quiet, hands folded, heart stuttering. He sat beneath an oil painting of Suleiman the Magnificent, sipping sherbet and studying you like one might study an ant on a chessboard. Recite the surah, he said. You did. Then he asked, do you know what we are? You hesitated. Servants of the Sultan. He smiled. No, we are ghosts in golden chains. It wasn't a riddle. It was a warning. Because in this world, everything glittered and everything watched. Walls were too thin, eyes too many. Even food betrayed you. Certain fruits were used to test behavior. Melons, for example. If a concubine ate too quickly, it showed greed. If he refused, it showed pride. The correct method? Slice slowly, smile gently, offer the first bite to a rival. You did it all. You even laughed when a favored boy accidentally dropped the Sultan's prayer beads. He was removed that evening. You didn't ask where he went, but you heard rumors, always whispered, about the outer quarters, a place where failed concubines were kept. Not killed, not yet, just set aside, left to clean chamber pots, translate foreign letters, or scrub fountains whose waters they were never allowed to drink. There were other horror stories, too. One boy was found singing to himself in the laundry chamber. He had lost his mind from years of silence. They said he was once a favorite until his beauty faded. Now he thought he was a bird, plucked and featherless. They buried him beneath the bathhouse. No marker, no prayer, just a pile of lime to speed the decay. Historians often debate how much autonomy the eunuchs and concubines truly held. Some suggest they were the real power behind the throne, pulling strings with perfumed fingers. Others argue they were puppets, no more able to shape their fate than a coin tossed in a wishing well. But within the palace, the truth was darker. It wasn't that you had no power. It was that power came with a price, and that price was everything you once were. You learned to smile when the Sultan's eyes landed on someone else. You learned to clap when a new concubine arrived, even though it meant your days were numbered. You learned to eat slowly, walk softly, sleep lightly, and pray only when no one watched. And still you survived. You even thrived, at least by palace standards. You were given a new robe, blue silk, lined with fox fur, a sign of seniority. The kitchen staff bowed lower when you passed. The junior eunuchs avoided eye contact. You had risen, but deep inside, something had begun to rot. Not your body. That remained pristine, perfumed, pressed. But the you inside, the boy from the village, the son of a mother who wept in the dust, he was fading, replaced by someone who had learned not to cry, not to hope, not to dream. The harem had its own language, its own physics. Time stretched and bent. Seasons passed without sun. You began to feel more at home with shadows than light, more kin to statues than to men. And you knew sooner or later your time would come. Even peacocks outlive their usefulness. It began with a cough. Nothing violent, just a shallow rasp that clung to the back of your throat one morning as you folded your robe. But in the palace, even illness could be a death sentence. You wrapped it in silence. You smiled more, bowed deeper, laughed gently at the Grand Vizier's jokes during his weekly visits to the harem garden. But you could feel it building, like dust collecting in a sealed room. The physicians were called eventually. Not for you, but for another concubine who collapsed during evening prayers. They moved through the chambers in their green robes, sniffing, tapping, prodding. One of them touched your wrist for a moment too long. That night, your name was not called. Not for tea service. Not for poetry. Not for anything. The silence was louder than thunder. You were moved 3 days later, quietly, without ceremony. The inner quarters shrank behind you as 2 eunuchs led you through a corridor you had never seen before. Its walls were blank, its floor dusty. You passed no candles, no guards, just echoing footsteps. It was called the Grey Wing. You weren't the only one there. You saw others, familiar faces now pale, worn thin like old linens. Some looked at you with dull eyes. Others stared into corners, murmuring prayers in forgotten dialects. One boy with trembling hands offered you a dried plum from his sleeve. He had no teeth. No one told you what you were now. But you knew. You were no longer beautiful, no longer useful, no longer wanted. The chamber they gave you was narrow. A mat, a bowl, a torn page from the Quran nailed to the wall. Your meals came late. Cold rice, sour goat milk. Sometimes just water, with a slice of lemon rotting at the edge. You were not forbidden to leave, but no one told you where to go. So you stayed. Occasionally, You heard the distant sound of music from the main halls, laughter, clapping, the rustle of silk robes. A reminder that life still moved in the harem, even if you no longer existed within it. Your cough worsened. It became hard to stand, to breathe, to remember how long you'd been in the gray wing. Time no longer worked properly there. Days melted into one another like wax. The air smelled of sweat and rose mold. Your joints ached from the cold. One night, a boy in the next room whispered that the gray wing had no official records. "No one checks," he said. "We're not even listed on the registers anymore." And that was when it truly sank in. You were being forgotten. Not killed, not exiled, just erased. And that was the most Ottoman cruelty of all. For the empire believed in records, every tax, every conquest, every conscripted boy. But those who failed to serve, who outlived their allure, who got sick or sad or strange, they were placed here, in the blank pages of the archive. Eventually, your name would fade even from memory. One morning, the eunuch who brought your food did not arrive. No one came that day, or the next. The bowl outside your door began to grow mold. You stopped coughing, not because you were healed, but because you were too tired. The silence had weight now. It pressed on your ribs, your skull, your memories. You thought about your village, about the sound of bells on goat necks, your mother's hands covered in flour, the carved wooden comb your sister once gave you. You couldn't remember the exact shape of her face anymore. That was the final theft. Not your voice, not your manhood, not your freedom. Your memory. The self that connected you to the world outside the palace. The boy who had been chosen. The youth who had learned to smile without desire. The shadow who had stood beside the prince. All gone. One morning, the door opened. Not with ceremony. Just a creak. A rustle of robes. Two men entered, eunuchs young, faceless. You didn't resist. You didn't speak. They wrapped you in a shroud. Not white, but brown. A laundry sack repurposed. You were carried through a service hallway, past dripping pipes and cracked tiles. And finally, into the garden behind the harem. Not the imperial garden, where tulips bloomed in geometric ecstasy. The other one, the one with no name. A narrow patch of dirt hemmed in by old walls. No markers, no stones, just shallow pits, some barely covered, where concubines and eunuchs had been laid for centuries. There were no prayers, no rituals, just the quiet shuffle of feet, the soft thud of a body being lowered. You landed among roots. No one said your name. No one remembered it. That afternoon, the Sultan welcomed a new concubine. She had eyes like sapphires, and her voice carried like silk across a still pool. He smiled when she bowed. The musicians played. The lamps burned bright. The harem continued. It always did. And so, we returned to silence. The kind of silence not found in tombs or temples, but in places where the world has chosen to forget. The hush that settles over gardens where no flowers grow. The stillness that clings to palace walls long after the footsteps have faded. The tale of the Ottoman male concubine is not one found in grand epics or imperial ledgers. It's written in shadows, traced in the soft scuff of slippers across marble, in the rustle of silk robes stitched for boys who would never become men, in the slow fading of names no one dared to speak aloud. These were not just victims of an empire. They were instruments, molded by ritual, maimed by tradition, hollowed by desire, and in their quiet erasure, they became something more than tragic. They became symbols of a forgotten machinery, one that ground beauty, obedience, and fear into a single perfumed silence. If their ghosts still linger, and some say they do, it is not in fury or vengeance. It is in longing, a longing to be remembered not as whispers behind brocade curtains, but as lives that once laughed, feared, and hoped in the flickering candlelight of a world that never saw them as whole. And maybe, just maybe by listening, we allow that silence to break. Just for a moment. But before we step deeper into this forgotten corridor of history, if stories like this awaken something in you, a fascination with the darker truths, the untold legacies, the shadows that shaped empires, then I invite you to tap that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden past. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you joining me from? I'm always amazed by how these long-buried tales are being rediscovered by curious minds across the globe, all of us connected by a hunger to understand the world not just as it was told, but as it truly was.